Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Wilson, and welcome to the first in Purposefully Humans conversations with global thought leaders and authors about the benefits of creating organisations that work and celebrate with what it means to be human. Today, we're joined by social innovator and the founder and CEO of UK-based company TIE, Philippa White. Hi, Philippa.
Hello, it's so great to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Before I get into full introductions, just a little bit about the structure of this conversation. In line with Purposefully Human's vision to be authentically human in everything we do, we aim for these sessions to be more friends catching up over coffee rather than job interview. With that in mind, although we've pre-recorded this session, we do have a few people here who are going to join in. Also part of being authentically human is me stumbling over my words. So let's just keep that in.
That's what we want. Yes.
So as I said, my name's Rebecca Wilson. I'm a business psychologist who works with leaders to help them understand how to infuse their strategies and ways of working with psychology, understanding how and why the people that we work with behave in the way that we do, how we can influence that and how that impacts the performance of the organisation. My co-host, Kristian K. Eriksson, hi Kristian, is also a business psychologist based in Oslo, Norway. Kristian's background is in sports and the commercial side of event management, and he has a particular interest in social identity theory and how it can be applied to better understand why and how people make decisions. Later, we also have another couple of guests for our coffee shop conversation, Kerry and Tez, who will be joining us to ask some further questions. So, Philippa, if you will indulge me for a moment to give a quick background that will probably not give full credit to all of your wonderful work, but I'll give it a go. So for 20 years, Philippa has been rewiring corporate leaders with her unique leadership development program approach for individuals, teams, and at scale. Born in South Africa and raised in Canada, Philippa relocated to the UK after a business exchange program in Thailand and now lives in Brazil. We might get into that later. She brings a people-first approach to business that fuels not just commercial success, but also contributes to a more sustainable world. Over her career, she has worked with some of the world's biggest businesses, helping their people develop the necessary human competencies to thrive. As a creator and host of the TIE Unearthed podcast and host of the London Evening with TIE events, Philippa is also an accomplished author with over 60 published articles and the recently released international best-selling book, Return on Humanity, which will be up here with lots of marks in it.
Thank you.
Philippa mentors and advises companies keen to adopt a more human approach to business, and the transformational power of work makes her an obvious choice then to invite Philippa in for a Purposefully Human conversation. So on behalf of the Purposefully Human team, Philippa, we're thrilled that you could join us today.
Well, thank you again for having me. It's really great to be here. And I'm looking forward to this very informal, as if we're just sitting around having a cup of coffee together conversation.
I've got my little cup of tea.
I've got my tea.
Excellent. So as mentioned in the introduction, Philippa, you've been dedicated to this cause for over 20 years. What was your original inspiration and what inspires you to continue?
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to tell a story. My book actually, I think it's the best way of bringing these sorts of things to life. And my book is actually called Return on Humanity, but it's leadership lessons from all corners of the world. And it is a business book of stories. So doing it justice, I'm going to start this with a story. So thank you for the introduction. And yes, I grew up in Canada and I was born in South Africa, have sort of lived all over the place. But I guess life, it was interesting because I did a presentation when I was in Aarhus in Denmark just now, and I gave a presentation. I was talking about how in Aarhus, life is it's just beautiful and so gorgeous and safe and structured and very different to my life here in Brazil. And I reflected on growing up in Canada, where I grew up. And I was saying how, life where I grew up in Canada, in Winnipeg, Manitoba, actually the license plates of all the cars, depending on the province you're from, has a slogan that articulates what that place is about. And I grew up in friendly Manitoba. And it's a little bit like friendly Aarhus. It's just a very lovely place to bring up children. And that's what my parents always said. But my family in South Africa had a very different upbringing and a very different reality. I was born during apartheid. My mom was from London. My dad was half South African, half Scottish. But anyway, he grew up a lot in South Africa. And for him, the apartheid issue was almost just a way of life. Whereas my mom was like, this is crazy. I'm not, we're not going to continue living in South Africa. And my uncle and aunt in South Africa, rather than just accepting it like a lot of South Africans did, they made it their mission to fight against the regime. And growing up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada-friendly Manitoba, I didn't really know what having a mission really was, a purpose. And I didn't know that word at that point. I mean, it wasn't something that we talked about. But when I would go to South Africa, I sensed what purpose meant. My uncle was Nelson Mandela's doctor when Nelson Mandela came out of prison and started negotiations with the apartheid government. They needed a doctor who he could trust that would ensure that he stayed alive and well, because if anything happened to him at that particular time in history, you could imagine like a civil war could have broken out. And I always found that so inspirational, the stories that my uncle and aunt talked about, and the fact that my uncle worked with Nelson Mandela. He never even talked about that. I kept bringing it up, and he's like, I did so many other things. That's not what, defines me. And he was this very humble man. And then he passed away. And I was working in London in 2004. He passed away in 2004 from melanoma. And I went to his funeral. And that funeral, or celebration of life, is actually what it was called. It was a celebration of his life. And it was that day that was the catalyst to what I do now and why I'm talking to you and why I've written this book. And it basically was a moment where I suddenly saw the world and my life from a very different perspective. And so I walked into this room and I saw a sea of faces, and these faces were from so many different walks of life. So we had comrades from the struggle, there was a health minister with his bodyguards, you had medical colleagues, you had family members, you had friends, you had people from the shanty towns, you had people from the local communities. It was literally looking at the society of South Africa, and you just basically cut it and you just saw everybody. And I looked at that and I thought, that's extraordinary. Not everybody has the power to be able to do that. And then there were a couple of people who spoke, and they were not on the roster to speak. So obviously you can imagine who was on the roster. You had sort of, pretty amazing people from the government and family members. But there were two people that put up their hands, and it's those two people that are the reason I'm doing what I'm doing now. So there was one man, he was a colored guy. And he put up his hand and he said, I'm not on the roster to speak, but I'd really like to speak. And so he walked to the front and he said, Neil was the only doctor in our community who made a point to learn our language. The rest of the doctors treated us like animals, and they were vets. And I thought, holy shit. Growing up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, I never even knew that to be a thing. It hadn't even it hadn't even registered that would even be a reality where people could not be, there wasn't that connection or that humanity between a patient and a doctor. And then this other woman, she put up her hand. She was this large African lady. She was extraordinary. She had an unbelievable presence, and she strode to the front of this room, and literally everyone was like, oh my God, she has got some stories, this lady, she's just unbelievable. And, so she walked to the strode to the front, and she stood there and she said, I was in jail for a part of apartheid. I was fighting against the regime. They caught me and I was put in jail. And I was in a Black jail because obviously I'm Black, and that would have also been in a Black part of town. Yet Neil, my friend, so this was not sort of white savior anything. This was my friend Neil, who made a point as my friend and as a doctor to come and visit me, and I could count on him on my watch. And I knew when he would be there, and he was there to check on me because I had health issues at the time, but also to tell me what was happening at the, on the outside. And she said he was the light at a very dark time in my life. And I was listening to these stories and I'm looking around at everyone. I'm thinking, oh my God, because my uncle was always one of these unbelievably inspirational people to me. I wrote short stories. I won a short story competition when I was 12, I think, for my province. I wrote about him. I just was always just enamored with him. But as I looked around, I realized, my goodness, he had impacted so many people. Look at all these people from so many different walks of life. Like, they had also really been inspired by him. But then I stopped and I thought, no, you know what? It works two ways. He inspired them, but also all of those people from so many different walks of life created him. So how does that work? He could have very, very easily lived life as a white South African during apartheid, very safe, very secure in his own little bubble, but he didn't. He had this fascination with perspective and possibility. He pushed himself out of comfort zones and actually put himself at risk many times. But by doing that, he saw himself and the world differently. And he used his privilege to be able to fix a broken system. And by stepping out of his world and exposing himself to other people, those people impacted him. Now, when I was reflecting on all of this, I was working in advertising in London. And I started to think about my life working in advertising in London. Yes. And I thought about, okay, I'm surrounded by a whole lot of people who are very similar to me, who studied at, similar sorts of universities and come from similar backgrounds. And then we go to the pub and we all hang out with the same sorts of people and have similar conversations. And then I go home and live with my flatmates, who also are either people I know or who are people that I know through other people I know who also come from similar backgrounds. We go to dinner parties with people we know. We go on holiday to places we might go traveling sort of to, but they're places that are pretty comfortable and places that we like and we've probably been to before, also with people that we know. But yet we are expected to give nuanced advice. We're expected to challenge, big problems. We're expected to innovate. We're expected to be able to big new brands or build brands. We're supposed to be inspirational leaders. But then coming back to my uncle and what I just had been reflecting on, but if we're doing the same thing all the time, living these very comfortable, safe lives, how do we develop the competencies and the perspectives in order to be able to do all this stuff that we need to be able to do as professionals? And then I reflected on the leaders that I admired in my life, my uncle being one of them, but also just anyone who had empowered me or who I thought, wow, that person is so amazing. They're so inspirational. And then you think about the competencies that that person has. And I mean, that's something that your listeners could do as well. Just reflect for a moment, who is that teacher or that family member or that boss? Why is it that that person stands out in your life? Why do you think about them every time where you think, God, I had this amazing boss once? Pretty guaranteed that that person also had those human competencies. So they were probably able to empathize. They were probably able to, they had probably a purpose. They probably challenged systems. They were probably incredibly flexible, very resilient. They had a vision. They saw the world differently. They probably had done things that had pushed them in new ways and provided that perspective that was so different. And it was with that I decided I need to create opportunities to be able to help leaders develop these competencies that are so absolutely fundamentally necessary for business, to be able to create that sense of belonging and connection, which at the end of the day, that is what creates much more competitive businesses on every level. Yes. And also, the more you have those perspectives, one, you are a better person and a better human, but you are much more innovative and you are much more competitive because you are more resilient. You have all of those key competencies that we need in leadership, particularly today, with that vision that then helps drive business into a more sustainable future.
A question that comes that isn't one of the ones that I've thought of before, but just as you were telling that story, with that inspiration, what was behind you choosing the path of influencing leaders and organizations rather than a broader community perspective where you might have, I mean, somebody with that inspiration might have been, I'm going to stand for politics because that's how I could change the world. Why did you choose?
Because I've known and it's a very, very good question. And I have known for a very long, since I started, the lever of change is with business. So NGOs are amazing and they're part of my business model. So the way that I expose people, so what I've created is a business, it's a leadership business that develops these competencies. I guess the next question is, how do we do that? Well, how we do that is it's all about exposing people to situations that are completely different to what they're normally used to, in order, using constraints at the core, problems that they've never been exposed to before, pushing them in ways that I like to say, I push people to the edge of their mental maps and gently nudge them off, forcing an evolution of change. And we create significant behavior change by exposing them to these global challenges in a short amount of time, using constraints at the core that gives them the opportunity to develop that resilience and that, work on that scarcity mindset to become more of a growth kind of, we can do anything resilient mindset. And we do it in a number of different ways. But I have partnerships I work in 26 countries around the world. I have, partners with organizations, NGOs, nonprofits, or social enterprises, literally all over the world, working with a whole number of different causes. So the third sector is a big part of my business model. And I could not do what I do without them. And actually in a bit, I'm sure I'll get to that, my definition of humanity is such that I think the exposure to different worlds is absolutely fundamental if you're going to be more human. Yes. But I do not believe that if we are going to make massive change, it is not going to happen with the third sector. It's not. We need the third sector. We need to understand the importance of bringing in different voices and collaboration that is fundamental to creating a more sustainable world. But the change is not going to happen with the third sector. And it's not going to happen with the government sector. Zero chance. It's way too bureaucratic, takes too long to make anything happen. It's so ineffective and crap. Where the change happens is the business. But the thing is business can be really good or business can be really bad. And at the end of the day, we need the leaders within business to be able to drive business in the direction that it needs to. So decisions can be made on a dime. They have much more resources, human and financial, and that's where the change happens. But that's also why we need to have leaders with the competencies to be able to drive these businesses into the future. And driving them into the future is more competitive. I mean, it's one and the same.
I'm going to bump up one of the questions I had for later in our conversation, but I think it fits in here. One of my frustrations, particularly recently, and maybe it's a factor of age and becoming more cynical or pragmatic, one of those, is just how many, like I totally, if there was a church of this conversation, I'd be worshipping in it. Totally agree with everything you're saying. And it's certainly part of, it is at the core of the work I do as well. But there are still so many organizations and leaders in organizations who are not behaving in this way. And so there's still a problem. Why are organizations not taking on the importance of this way of thinking? Obviously, there are some that are, and do you see a tipping point coming? Are we going to tip over to the point where we can say, now we are putting humanity at the center rather than profit and technology and all of the other things that are inhuman?
Yeah. Well, I think it's like anything. So it's like any business trends, actually, I wouldn't even say business trends. It's wherever that wave takes us, we can't control it. I mean, we've got psychologists here, right? So we know how business, we also know how people behave. People will only behave and change something if it no longer works for them, right? So none of this can be a charitable exercise, none of it. Not even women having more of a place in business can be a charitable exercise. It's just business is better and more competitive. And I have all the stats to prove that if women are at the table. I mean, I've got a book of stats to prove that. So it's the same thing with more human organizations. We know that there's a huge increase of absenteeism. People are quietly quitting. People are quitting. People are not interested. They're completely apathetic at work. If they're not engaged, so you've got, don't have connection, don't feel belonging. That costs a lot of money. The cost of people not being connected to work, this apathy, not having this sort of human experience where they actually want to be working where they're working. It's costing US companies per year $500 billion. That's really a lot of money. Mm-hmm. If companies are more human, if people feel connected, if people like what they're doing, and this makes sense because I know myself, if I am genuinely really excited about something that I'm doing, I will put all of my energy into it. I show up, I'm, there early, I'm engaged, I'm coming up with ideas, I'm riffing on this, I'm excited. That's what you want at a company. A company is 23% more profitable if you have that. And it makes sense. If you have a whole lot of people who are just showing up for work, who actually don't really want to be there, and actually their purpose, for example, doesn't even align with what the company is. So they're just in roles to make money, and no one actually really cares if they're there or not. And they don't even know if they're adding any value or not. You're not going to get the best out of those people. So it's a money game. It's a competitive advantage. And if you don't start creating those environments, then you're not going to have that result. But I think what's really important, I was on a panel at a conference a couple months ago, and there were all these big CEOs from all these massive companies. So I mean, literally name the company, the CEOs were at this event. And on the stage with me, there were a few different really big CEOs of massive companies. And they were saying, if it's up to me to be able to drive the future of this business for the culture of this business is up to me to create. And if I'm the one who chooses that for it to be a certain way, then it's going to be that way. And I disagreed with that. And I said, actually, I don't agree with that. I think to an extent that needs to be driven from you. But at the end of the day, it's actually all the leaders within businesses need to be, they need to have these human competencies, because it's totally impossible to have a human company without leaders who are in touch with these human competencies. So if you don't have people who are empathetic, who want to empower people, who are flexible, who understand the importance of happiness in business, making other people around you happier, understanding the importance of flexibility and being resilient and creating that resiliency. If people don't understand those concepts, then your company is never going to have that. And so that's why understanding the importance of developing those competencies in my mind are really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Kristian, I will just keep asking questions, but I know that you have some things that you wanted to ask, Philippa.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions based on that. It's a really interesting conversation. I'm really curious about the geographical aspects of your leadership development programs. You mentioned tapping into out of comfort zone and challenging mental maps.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you make any adjustments, whether the people you're working with are in Scandinavia or if they're in the United States.
I mean, it's a really good question, actually, because I've had clients in the United States and I have a client in Scandinavia. So it's a really good question. I would say no. I mean, when I'm looking at the program, so like I say, I've got a number of different programs and we do things in a number of different ways. So, I just did a workshop in Scandinavia that included a lot of exercises that took people into different ways of thinking, but of course they physically, didn't leave anywhere. And also even when we're doing virtual cohort opportunities where we expose people to initiatives in the global south. So it could be in Iraq, it could be Syria, it could be Brazil, it could be Malawi, it could be Tanzania. I mean, Brazil, we've got a load of different opportunities. That exposure to that experience that is so completely different, I would say doesn't in any way change depending on the culture that those people come from or the country that they come from. What I'm going to be doing with this client in Denmark, we're creating an opportunity that's more based on what are the competencies and the characteristics that we're wanting to, and the challenges that that particular company has, and what are we wanting to focus on. And then I will be linking up an organization in Brazil, for example, because they know about, they've had to reimagine the future. They've had to sort of see things differently. And that knowledge of what they've done will be really helpful for that brand to sort of see how they can reimagine the future, or, the importance of creativity. And therefore, an organization that we work with in Zambia is this beautiful organization that's just rooted in creativity and using street kids. And so it's finding interesting links to what we're wanting to do with the organization and therefore with the people. And we use that as an inspiration. Or on the flip side, it could be that companies want to better understand a certain area. So they want to better understand about the environment, or they're really passionate about the environment. So they really would like to do a project with a particular organization, but they're always focused on unleashing these human competencies. That's sort of the focus. I hope does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answered it. I have a follow-up one more oriented towards organization as well. You mentioned in your book that the TED Talk by Thomas Björkman,
Yes.
which connect inner development goals, societal and cultural influences, basically the future of the planet. From your experience, how does this play out when you look at Scandinavian organization, as he talks about, to say those in the US, where they place human experience in their priorities?
Yeah, so the question's a really interesting one. And I think I might step back a little bit so the listeners understand the context of this, because I think this story is amazing. And actually, I have a podcast with Eric Fernholm, which he talks about the Nordic secret. And I highly recommend looking for the Nordic secret, but you can, also listening to that podcast of mine, which is a really, really amazing one. And he's a happiness expert. But he talks about the Nordic secret, one, because it's so relevant to what we're facing now in the world today. So this goes back to the time in Scandinavia when historically the region was moving from being agrarian to industrial. And the leaders of the region, so I mean, it was all the countries of Scandinavia, they recognized that at a time like this, it creates a lot of unrest. And actually, we know that because also just as individuals, if your family's going through a divorce, or you're moving house, or the stability of what you've been used to changes, you become very vulnerable. And as a child, or if you're having a divorce or whatever it is, you become very, very vulnerable to the outside world. And the leaders of the region recognized this. And what is so interesting, because they were really worried about really right-wing politicians being able to manipulate people. And they said,
that does sound familiar.
and what we need to do to be able to secure the people of our nation, because at the end of the day, the only way we can secure our nation is through the people. And the only way we can do that is instilling them with self-awareness. So they created these Nordic folk high schools, and they recognized that it needed to be a certain age of a person. So it needed to be sort of late teens to early 20s. So from what I understand, it was sort of that age group. And they put them all over Scandinavia. And the sole purpose, and they were state funded, but they were not state run. And the whole purpose was to create the stability of these individuals to ensure that they could weather any external forces, variables that could influence them. And it was so successful that there was a guy from the States who heard about these folk schools, and it was after the Second World War, I think. And he went, studied them, and then he set up one in Tennessee, I think it was. And shortly after, a woman had been a part of this high school in the States. She was on a bus, and this was in the 1950s. She was on a bus, and someone said, "You can't sit there, you need to move." And she said, "I'm not moving." They said, "You need to move." "Nope, I'm not going to move." And it was Rosa Parks. And so from that point of view, one, because understanding the power of inner development and that strength, that inner strength, is of course fundamental, particularly now. We've got a lot of elections. We've had a lot of elections, and we're about to have another one. And there's just a lot of unrest, obviously, all over the world. And so having that inner strength is really important. One, as individuals, but also as regions, but of course as companies as well. And this is why it's really, really important to have that. I obviously have this client in Denmark. It's a new client. And so I've only just started working with them. And I wouldn't say that I have enough of an opinion to be able to drive huge, opinions around, the success or of leadership skills. What I can say is there is a risk of being too homogeneous with hiring. And as any group from anywhere, if it's too much of one culture, that isn't competitive, because we need to have diversity of thought. And there's a whole lot of people who are from Scandinavia living and working in Scandinavia. And I think that the challenge perhaps that might be in that region is being able to bring in more diversity of thought so that the companies can be more competitive. But from the point of view of, as a culture, being very collective and being very supportive, I would say that from what I saw, it was a very, very kind and unbelievable culture. I'd never been to Scandinavia before, and I was just blown away. I absolutely loved it. But one of the challenges I think that this particular company has anyway is that it's too homogeneous. They need to get in more diversity of thought so that you can one, be more resilient, but also have the different ways of thinking.
Yeah.
And I know that hasn't completely answered your question, but.
No, but it's such an interesting observation, and it's one that I've only really opened myself up to recently in moving from Australia to the UK, although obviously those two places are very similar culturally. What being in this region has allowed me is to open myself up to so many different cultures.
Yeah.
And my observation from a lifetime in Australia, I've traveled quite extensively, but actually living in a place is very different. we're quite insular as a country. You know, globally, there's a stereotype that the US and Americans are quite insular, and maybe there's some truth to that. But Australia, simply because of its isolation as far as its location and how long it takes to get anywhere and how much it costs to get anywhere, there's really, I think, the risk that you spoke of with Scandinavia and not being homogenous enough in their hiring. I think that's something that Australia definitely suffers from. Not
one thing I
exclusively.
just wanted to compliment. I just had to open my book and find a quote from it, because this quote from me, and it's back to the inner development and the importance of this inner development for the strength of companies, but also for the strength of the world. There was this Andrew Bovarnik, who's the global head, food and agricultural commodity systems at the UNDP. He basically says, I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy.
Mm-hmm.
And again, interestingly,
Wow.
back to Scandinavia. So when you compare to the US and you compare to Scandinavia, I mean, it is so collective in Scandinavia, and it's thinking of the other person. And I found it amazing just how wonderful the culture was. It really is so thoughtful. And, if people just talk to you and they're just so friendly, and there's a lot of thought about people take their holidays, and there's a lot of respect for people's time and their family time. And, that does not happen in the US. And I think, and again, I don't know enough about Scandinavia, but I would imagine that the concerns about the environment are much richer in Scandinavia versus the US, and therefore, strengths of companies actually being more, thinking in more sustainable ways. But again, that all has this ripple back to what we talked about with the Nordic secret. It's this self-awareness. It's, if you are self-aware, if you understand who you are, you also understand your impact on other people. It works both ways. You have a sense of self, but you have a sense of yourself, of interconnectedness, how I impact other people around me. I mean, that's
Yes.
that it kind of works both ways.
Yes.
I think that is something we might in Scandinavia take for granted. It's something we don't think about, that other people do not have, or that there's something not existing. I think that's a really interesting point.
Absolutely. Definitely. I might bring in Tez and Kerry, because I'm sure, I know both of them, and I know that they're probably champing at the bit to have a say. So I will...
poor things. They're only coming in now. Oh.
Do I need to ask them to start their video? Apparently I can't actually start their video for them.
Hi, Kerry. Hi, Tez.
Hi. Hi.
Was I right, Kerry?
You guessed it, yeah.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Shall I start, Tez?
Yes, yeah, please.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah. Okay, I really love this idea of like inner development and inner strength. And a question that was just coming up for me is I'm just curious about any of the like hurdles that you encounter, maybe with leaders or with people who either maybe think they're self-aware and aren't, or if there are any other kind of common obstacles you bump up against regularly.
I love this question. Yes. And actually, I'm posting about it today, and I just didn't manage to get the thing together in time, so I'll be posting about it later. But it's fascinating. Yes, I would say the biggest challenge, I don't know, there's a lot of challenges, but one thing that does come up quite a bit is this point around vulnerability. So we all know the importance of being vulnerable, right? The more vulnerable you are, the more people connect with you, the more authentic you are. And the more you recognize that probably you don't have all the answers, and there's probably other people that do have the answers, and you could be the boss of the entire company, but there's probably other people who know how to do things better than you, and the quicker you recognize that, the better your company will probably be. And then you can kind of give that power over to other people. But for some reason, leadership has become this thing where people think that they need to have all the answers, or they just sort of bulldoze everything, and they don't bring in those, that interdependence, that sort of unlikely partnerships, those other voices. Because no, we just have all the answers. We know what the problems are. We don't even need to have the conversations. So we'll just sort of. And so, well, I work a lot with that, with the work that I do. One, because again, to be more human, I think you do need to have a really good understanding of the power and importance of interdependence and how we do need to bring in other voices. But to really understand that, you do need to understand this concept of vulnerability. And so when you can imagine where you have the sort of really, the leaders who are used to running teams in this cohort, who are now having, in a very short amount of time, having to create the solution for something in sort of 6 weeks, and they're working on a problem that they've never understood before. So it could be the Mesoamerican reef region in Guatemala and Honduras, and sort of understanding the reefs. It could be people who have struggled with an ISIS attack in Iraq, the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil, whatever it might be. But without question, in order to be able to understand these issues, you need to ask the people on the ground, what's happening. And you probably do need to say, I don't know, and then open yourself up to find out. But it's fascinating. Even though I have this conversation with the teams, I've been doing this for 20 years, like almost every time. I would say halfway through the process, I sometimes have people crying, and they'll call me, and they're really, really, senior individuals. And I do have tears, but not always. But, it's also people who sort of feel like they need to lead the team, even though that's not actually how it works. It's sort of everyone's working together and everyone's equal. But anyway, sort of they put that pressure on themselves. I must lead the team. I don't have all the answers. And they'll sort of say, we're halfway through, we haven't got the answers. Like, I don't know. I haven't had that aha moment. I don't know what the answer is. And I said, okay, well, have you picked up the phone and contacted the organization and just said that you don't know, and then maybe asked for a couple more questions? Well, no. Like, I feel like we can only contact them when we have the answers. And I was like, but how are you going to have the answers if you just contact the organization and say that you don't know yet, and just say can I have a couple of more conversations? Pretty much guaranteed, if you have a couple of conversations, maybe with a beneficiary, with a person from the community, it will open up your thinking. You're just going to see things differently, and you're going to find the answer. Yeah, but don't you think that we need to go with things sort of organized? I'm but you can't get there unless you say that you don't know. You just have to say that you don't know. Yeah. And it's unbelievable, because these are really smart people, but they get stuck in their own worlds. Mm-hmm. It's all about appearances, or what I need to sort of be able to show, or I can't say that I don't know. I'm like, well, actually you can, and you should. It's a powerful ability that you have. And if you don't know how to do that, you're actually worse off, but it takes strength to be able to see that. So.
I was actually just talking to somebody the other day, actually Charlie from the foundation, who I know that about the prize. We have held up the prize for so long as being the solution, rather than the prize being understanding the problem fully.
Yeah, totally.
So those people who aren't open to, they want to go with the solution because that's the prize. But the prize is actually in fully understanding the problem, and then the solution just seems to come. But really,
that's a big problem. That's so many companies that I talk to. I mean, people are launching products not knowing what the problem is, and then they wonder why they fail.
Yes.
And this happens all the time. This happens, and not just in the private sector. This happens all the time in the third sector, all the time. You have these colonial powers that go to the poor people in Africa and are like, we are going to solve your problems by implementing this solution. And they're like, we don't even want that. That doesn't, we're not even going to use it. And you have people at the UN who are making insane decisions about, for example, fuel efficient stoves is one of the projects that we work with. So the UN makes these big decisions to then send these electric fuel efficient stoves to all of these really, really poor people. The stove, they can't afford to run them. They can't afford to run the electricity. They still cut down the trees, build their fires, and the stove sits rusting in the corner. It's just like taking up space and they need to figure out where to throw it away. So it's just, there's this huge disconnect between understanding what the real need is. But the only way that you can understand these needs is stepping out of your normal world, having conversations with people that you don't normally have conversations with, and knowing the questions that you need to ask. But unfortunately, people don't do it enough. And so you see it in all levels of everything.
Yeah. Fantastic. Great question, Kerry. Thank you.
Yeah, really good question.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was actually like, just to link to what Kerry asked, like how often do you encounter like resistance from those companies to actually make the difference?
So when you're saying the companies to make a difference, because the companies that I work with, I'm not working with them to make a difference. I'm working with them to develop their people. And through that, the outcome is that we make a difference. It's a good question because it's interesting. Over the years, I've been doing this for 20 years. And as you can imagine, any company that's been doing anything for that amount of time, there's a lot of iterations. And you start in one place. And if you look back where we were 20 years ago and where we are now, it's a very different story. Now, 20 years ago, people talked about corporate social responsibility. And it was like this little division within a company. And it was like that little division where people just did some good. And it was kind of like, okay, if we do good, this like 2%, that can justify all the crap that we do the rest of the time. Now, my company fit into that 2%. So people are like, okay, we're going to do good by being involved with TIE, and that kind of makes us look good. It was also how I positioned TIE. So TIE was kind of like, back then, it was kind of be the change you want to see in the world. And there were the odd companies that bought it. And it was still the same. I do things quite differently now, but it was still the same idea. And I still believe that the private sector is the biggest driver of change, the same, taking people out of their comfort zones, getting them to see themselves in the world differently. Like the whole thing was still the same, but it was how I positioned it and where that money came from. The world has changed a lot. Are people buying? Well, first of all, I don't even believe in corporate social responsibility. That's like, to me, that's dead in the water. And that doesn't in any way. I have changed my view, and I think any company that looks at corporate social responsibility doesn't get it. It's not about that anymore. It's about how you do everything. It's about stakeholders. It's about how does what we do impact the world and the people that work with us, and like civil society, and we can make a profit at the same time, but not at the expense of everything else. And if you are still doing that, then you will not be competitive for very much longer, because people will not believe in you. People will not want to work for you. And actually, if people don't believe in you and people don't want to work with you, then that's people who don't want to buy your stuff, and people don't want to work for you. So you're not going to be able to hire anyone. And then like, I don't know how you're going to be competitive. So that's kind of dead in the water. The thing is I don't believe that people are buying TIE because they want to do good. And it's back to the thing that we talked about at the beginning. This is no longer a charitable exercise. This is about being competitive. So are people buying TIE because they want to have more human competencies and all that kind of stuff because they're wanting to sing kumbaya? Not at all. They genuinely are like, okay, we are not going to be competitive businesses if we do not have these leaders, and if they don't have these perspectives, and they don't understand how the world works outside of their little bubbles. And that's what I provide for people. And the nice thing that makes me be able to go to bed at night and feel happy about myself is that with every project that we work on, we're also impacting the world. So, but that's like a nice thing that's an outcome, and not just through the project. So each project has a positive outcome, but also the individuals that go through my programs, they see themselves in the world in a completely different way, and then they become drivers of change. So it kind of works in both ways.
Yeah. I wonder whether that's...
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wonder if that's also organizations buying leadership development programs because they think it's the right thing to do, or because it's just a thing that businesses do, rather than doing it so that their business becomes more competitive. Like they don't understand they don't understand the problem enough. So they've just, I mean, I've been involved in leadership programs, particularly earlier in my career, where they weren't necessarily linked. They were all about making us better leaders and better people, but there wasn't the link back to what will this mean for our organization when you do become more strategic and you're thinking more empathetic, more coach your people better, all of those sorts of things. It's
But it's also like, yeah, it's really interesting, but it's, you know, I'm finding it fascinating because the people I'm talking to, so I have this client in Denmark. I mean, talk about an incredible guy. Like I'm not even working with the leadership development team, or I'm not working, I think eventually, but like my client is global head of innovation.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right? Like we're talking, and the people that get it are going to be driving these businesses into the future. I mean, that's,
yes.
You know, if you're going to, the only way that you can drive a business into the future is if your people know how to be creative and have that resilience and have all, you know, they need to be able to see the world differently. They need to be resilient. They need to have, you know, and if the team is really safe and really secure, and again, sort of just like, oh, just going into work and doing, you know, it's that you need to engage individuals. You need to get them excited. And so how do you do that? It's through this kind of stuff, and it gets them thinking, and it puts them on the front foot, and all the rest kind of follows, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm conscious of time, and I'm also conscious of all of the questions that are stacking up in my head. But I want to go back to you guys, Kristian, Kerry, and Tez. Do you have any other burning questions that you'd like to ask?
I just had one thought. I'm not sure this might be too specific, but can you think of a small example of how somebody might, in just their day-to-day life, expose themselves to something new, like within the constraints of like, got to do my work, got to make my dinner, but like, is there something that we can just all do tomorrow to like change our
your questions are so good. Yeah. I mean, I think it's really great to leave people with sort of takeaways. And I think it's, again, it kind of comes down to, you know, a million years ago, I wrote something. Sir John Haggerty is one of my contacts, and I went for lunch with him just actually when I was in London, and he's a huge inspiration for me and always has been. And he talks about do interesting things and interesting things will happen to you. That's sort of his mantra. And we wrote a piece a million years ago, like I guess like literally like 15 years ago. But I still come back to this because it's in my book. I have it in my book as well, like some of the points. It's sort of be curious. So be curious, ask questions. Like, why is it that children are the only ones that ask a whole lot of questions? Why do we not ask questions anymore as adults? Like, ask questions, you know, push like beyond your boundaries. And he says it in a much more articulate way. And I can't remember what it is. I should have prepared this, but I didn't. So it's sort of just push yourself in new ways. So just find something. It's a sort of Eleanor Roosevelt quote, which is like, just do something every day that scares you. I mean, it's kind of true. Find a way. And it's unbelievable how if you really, David Bowie, actually, he's amazing. He said, in order for him to just constantly be reinventing himself, he would on purpose, first he would clear his mind. So he believes in the beginner's mind. The beginner's mind is a really, really powerful concept. So just like find the opportunity, go on holiday and properly go on holiday. Like go on holiday, turn everything off and completely clear your mind for 2 weeks. Don't go onto email, and then, so if you do that, you clear your mind. Because when I did that 2 years ago, that's when I had enough space in my mind to then write a book. I mean, it's a powerful, powerful process. If you're constantly like, no, I'll just like check my emails. I'm like, no. Cut yourself off completely, like clear your mind. But then also with David Bowie, he did that a lot, but also he pushed himself in situations where he said, if you're in a situation where your feet are just not quite touching the ground, you know you're in the right place. And I really genuinely believe that. Just push yourself, try to push yourself in ways that your feet aren't, and just say yes to things. Say yes. If you're like, oh no, I'm not going to be very good at that, just say yes. Say yes and see what happens. See what happens. Jump before you're ready. And then the final thing is expand your personal circle. It's so powerful. How can you do that? Well, in everyday situations, have a conversation with the Uber driver. Don't just go in and sit there on your phone. Have a conversation. I promise you, it will take you into a world that is fascinating. And if you literally do these things regularly, your life will look very, very different.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, My goodness. I actually became an Uber driver a few years ago for about 6 months. There was stuff going on in my life and I became an Uber driver, and oh my God, I loved it so much.
I can't even imagine the people that you met. I mean, how
stories,
amazing. Maybe everybody should do that.
Absolutely. Everybody should do it. It doesn't earn you any money really, but the growth and the everything else I earned was beautiful. Any other questions?
Yeah. It's not really like a question, but it just made me wonder how this approach would be even possible in a country where it's really built within the culture of the country. Like every single company is quite similar with this approach. It just stuck in the same ways. And people have basically the same mentality. And even if you have some kind of diversity, it's not really diverse. Because I'm from Czech Republic, I moved back home for a while, and if you see other people, they are usually from Slovakia, which we just separated 30 years ago, so that's nothing, or Ukraine and Poland, and we are still like pretty same. And it's quite like, okay, if you meet foreigners, they are just tourists mainly. There are some people like exchange students and some people from different countries, but it's still quite rare. So the diversity is not as frequent here. And therefore the mindsets are quite similar. And I feel like if we would have it higher and if we would expand our knowledge and so on, we could be more competitive as a state, but we are not.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know it's not a question. It's just like, it really made me wonder.
But it is a problem. I'm going to recommend a book other than my book. But I highly recommend this book. It's so good. It is so good. I bought it for somebody on my team actually recently. It's called Rebel Ideas, and it's by Matthew Syed. It's about the power of diversity, but he writes it. There's a lot of stories in it as well, but he writes it in incredible ways. And I mean, it's not answering your question. I think what it does do is just say how dangerous that is. And I'm not saying that you can't be proud of where you're from. And obviously there are going to be some places. I mean, London is obviously going to be very different to what you're talking about. You know, London is like this place where everyone kind of gets drawn to. But as a company, I'm not talking about as a society, but as a company, it's a very difficult challenge. And at the end of the day, if companies are going to be thinking progressively, if they are going to be responsive, if they are going to be able to be on the front foot and respond to all of this stuff that's going on that we're facing and is not going away, there does need to be some kind of diversity of thought. There has to be. And so, you know, what does that look like? And it's not hiring, you know, in like of yourself. It is getting different people to kind of want to come in and be a part of, you know, whatever that mission is of the company. But it is a case of like survival now.
Yeah, no, I see it the same way, because the people are more prone to get together with people that are more similar to them, which is like natural. But if you if you come to someone that like, oh, let's hire this person, they would be quite resistant, and it will take a longer time to actually make it a change in many cases.
People just need to understand, and people just need to understand why it's really important not to do that. Read the book. You'll love it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we are running very quickly out of time. So unless anyone has what would be a really quick question, or Philippa, if you had any final thoughts that you wanted to add?
I mean, my final thoughts would just be thank you so much for having me. I don't want to take up any more time. I feel like I've spoken way too much, but thank you for having me. It's always a huge honor just to have the opportunity to share my thoughts. If anyone wants to get in touch, feel free. You know, I've got the podcast as well if you want to listen to some of the different stories on there. It's Thai Unearthed. And just check out, you know, philippajwhite.com or Thai Unearthed or thaileadership.com, and you'll be able to find all you need.
Thank you so much, Philippa. I'm sure we could have talked for hours. I was not expecting a story that mentioned David Bowie, so that was
you invite me on these things, anything can come out.
Thank you, Kristian, for sharing the load, particularly in the lead up, and to Kerry and Tez for some great questions.
Really good questions.
Finally, thanks to all of you listening to this conversation. Purposefully Human is all about you. We've covered some really powerful insights, and we hope that you're leaving with new ideas and inspiration to carry forward. Remember, it's not just about hearing these concepts, but thinking about how you can apply them. And Philippa certainly gave us some really great direction there. As always, keep being authentically, beautifully, purposefully human, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.